go ahead, Virgil, it's yours.
All right, thank you, Joel. I sure appreciate the introduction. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, and I see that there's even a couple here from overseas, so I'll say good evening, or close to that of. My name is Virgil Carroll. A little bit about me before I start. Obviously, I'm out of the U.S., and I actually am originally from the great state of Alaska, so hopefully most of you out there have heard about it. I'm a certified smartass and plain speaker, otherwise I tend to speak my mind, which I think is very appropriate with this conversation that we're going to have here about how we really work with stakeholders and kind of do the best around our website builds and that. I'm a huge user experience person, so anything you ever hear me talk about will always have user experience kind of bled into it. I've been building websites since 1998. I do have a blog and a Twitter. Just one logistical thing before we get started. If you happen to have any questions, there's a Q&A area in the GoToWebinar interface that you can ask a question, and we'll be paying attention to that. Otherwise, if you're having any issues from audio or anything like that, you can just put that in the chat window, and we have somebody who's actually monitoring that as well. So what we're going to do today is we're basically going to talk about a few things, why we're kind of not successful when we're talking about working with stakeholders and some of the unique challenges that we have around that, how we can really do this better, and then I'm going to talk about a few lessons I've kind of learned throughout my days of doing this and some things that we've done from there. So, well, why are we not successful when we talk about building major, especially major web projects where we're working with a lot of different stakeholders? I really like this quote because I think this really kind of pulls it into focus by taking it out, and that's by Ansel Adams. It says, there's nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept. And so a big part of what I talk about a lot is about how we need to kind of gain a much better understanding of the things that we're looking at and how they all affect our projects and that. So one of the big reasons is, you know, people are really scared of what we do. You know, when we start talking about user experience, when we start talking about usability, information architecture, and everything like that, it's often about saving something in that. And what I mean by that is either your website's really bad and somebody's job can be on the line, or it could be that there's some new initiative that's out that you're trying to get some work done around, or whatever it is. But a lot of times when you're actually trying to do something and you're actually getting business stakeholders to understand that UX actually needs to be part of the process, it's because something's went really wrong in that. Ideally, we'd always have these projects where these were known up front and you would build them out the first time. But the reality is a lot of people tend to think that, you know, just make it pretty pictures and that kind of stuff and you're going to be perfectly fine. The other thing is business people don't really understand the process. This is one thing that we all run into all the time, is when we try to bring in especially user experience into a process, a lot of business people really kind of struggle with it. Yeah, they get excited about it once they kind of understand the benefits, but overall it's one of those soft, fluffy things over here that a lot of people don't always really understand or appreciate the value of. And a lot of times what we end up having to do is we end up having to play a lot of offense but recognize our defense. And so what I mean by this is a lot of times the scenarios are that somebody is very defensive about maybe the process you're going to go through, what you're going to do there, and you kind of have to push through that. And so as I kind of talked there, we do a lot of government work, and obviously one of the things we see a lot with the government is that we have a lot of people that feel very much ownership of their own little fiefdom or their own little area of the website, where it's like it's the mine, mine, mine principle, as I like to call it. And so they like it because it's mine, it's mine, it's mine. In that, and so a lot of times we have to recognize that, and not only do we have to push through that, but we also have to gain some understanding about why these people are defensive in the first place and what their concern is and kind of do it. And the reality is, even though maybe those of us that work in the field think of us as designers, as information architects, as usability specialists, as business analysts and that, the reality is we always get grouped with IT, and that's just one of those big things that we always have to understand, where there's not a negative in IT. In a lot of organizations there's a negative perception about it, that this is going to be a project that's going to get bogged down, it's going to be a piece of software that nobody's going to like, there's going to be a process that nobody wants to do, there's going to just be all these things that kind of hit around an IT type organization in that. And even though we may think of ourselves as separate, a lot of times people think of us as part of that information technology world. The other reason is people just don't like change. I tell you, I live in the state of Minnesota, and for anybody who's been here or knows anything about it, I always call Minnesota the most conservative, liberal state on the planet. Otherwise, in politics, we always vote liberal, but from just the way we think about it, we're very conservative in that we don't like change about anything in that. And so a lot of the perception is, I love change as long as I don't have to do it myself. In that I love change, I want everything else to change, I want everything to be better, but don't put it on me that I need to do something to actually make that change happen. And so people a lot of times react to this. They think of change as very different. They're kind of used to that over-promising and under-delivered, and so that again is another reason that we kind of get looped into that IT world. So a lot of times there's IT projects that promised the world and thought everything was going to go great and everything was going to be wonderful and hunky-dory, when the reality is what ends up happening is that the software doesn't meet expectations, or there was bad planning, there was bad rollout, whatever it might be. And so one of the challenges we really have from this side is that people don't like change, so we have to kind of bring them along through the process, and we have to help them educate about it, which is another thing we're going to talk about as we get further into the conversation. And I kind of already touched on this, but this one I think is very important. People like control, and so one of the things, especially in government organizations, that I see a lot is that people have this concept that I like to call the mind, mind, mind principle. And the mind, mind, mind principle is basically exactly that. It's people want ownership, they like their control, and when you actually dig down into why they won't give up any of that control, it's really because it's mine. And it's like, well, why is that? Because it's mine, it's mine. It's something that I control, that I have access to. It's something that I'm a little ownership of, and that's very important to people. And so we have to understand from this side is that overall one of the probably the #1 concerns we get out of people when we actually start changing and stuff, especially in the world that I work at, where a lot of times what we're doing is we're making massive changes to really large websites, and these changes are going to be extremely significant, not only in the architecture, the information, and how it's going to be organized in that, but also the design and also the content, and potentially we're rewriting the content on a lot of people's areas and that kind of stuff. There's a lot of change for people to really absorb there, and one of the things is they feel like, well, are you taking ownership away from me, and what does that mean for my world? Does that mean I don't own my content anymore? So there's a lot that you have to think about around that side, and that you have to understand that a lot of people get very concerned with that piece as well. And then we come to kind of what I say, and so I do this for the higher ed because I actually gave this talk for this, but I think higher education is a very, very good example of what goes wrong out there in the world of development. Some of the most challenging cases we've ever had are kind of in that higher ed space, where higher ed tends to have it in there. So you know, from there, what I say is the recipe for disaster is you take 4 cups of lack of administrative support. So one of the things we commonly see is that kind of business stakeholders and that don't support the project in the way that we need it, or don't support the organizational change or anything that needs to happen around kind of this new process and that. The other thing that we said a lot is that a lot of people think they're smarter than our users. One of the most common things we ever hear in there is, I know exactly how the people that visit the website are thinking about our stuff because they call me or they've talked to me and that kind of stuff. And through all of our research and all the things we do, the only thing I can tell you is these people don't know anything about what their people are looking for in that, from the most part. They think they do, but a lot of times they're doing it. The other thing that we run into in the government space a lot, which, you know, might be still in some organizations, but overall in the government tends to be a very big thing, is kind of this whole concept of bitching without consequences. Otherwise, there isn't exactly the same, how do I say it, the same ramifications of somebody saying something in a governmental organization, because there's not necessarily the normal, like you're sitting with your boss and your boss is going to fire you, yada, yada, yada. and that kind of stuff. And one of the things that we see a lot in higher ed is kind of this whole thing of academic freedom. So we actually add faculty on top of this, and faculty has this perception that they should get to do whatever they want in there. So the overall point of this slide is really to kind of help you understand that there's a lot of things that can go into basically making your website a disaster. And so what we're going to talk a lot about through the rest of this talk is really about what can we do about that and how can we go through it. And so really the consequences of that is that we have a roadblock in front of us, and that roadblock could be one thing, or that roadblock could be a lot of different things, and that kind of stuff. So we really want to kind of understand what that roadblock is, and roadblock or roadblocks, and we really want to kind of push through that from there. So anybody who's ever heard me talk has seen this slide before, but basically this has always been the way it is, in that we kind of have to baseline and say, well, why do we kind of talk about this stuff? Because we have to think about the way people think about the world of web that we do in the first place, and that's that a person asks a question, some kind of magic happens, and the person receives the answer. And where that really comes from is that people tend to think of Google and Amazon and that as their web impressions and that, and there's so much time and effort that get put into the customization of those experiences, but people have a really hard time translating it. And overall, we might understand the technology behind these things and how that kind of works. From a end user perspective, they really have no clue of what's happening in that. All they know is that they're maybe either losing some control, or they're getting new things, or that they're supposed to get to something. So the reality is of this slide that is very key is that no matter all the technical side that goes behind you delivering information in the way you think it is, overall it fundamentally comes down to, can the person find it easily? So how can we do this a little bit better? Well, the first thing is we have to look at a lot of things that kind of go into whether a website is going to be successful or a website is going to fail. And so as you can see, I kind of have this scale here on this screen where I kind of talk about this. And so in our experience in that is that one of the key sources of failure is people's opinions, their agendas that they come with on their own, so their ideas, their thoughts about how things should work, and that kind of stuff. Where the success is really looking at things both on a subjective side but also on an objective side, where we're looking at functional design, some of the solid structure that needs to be there, and good people experience, and we're going to kind of talk about a lot of those things. But overall the point is the more we base website development off of the information people give us, and say you sit down with a business stakeholder, you ask them some questions, you sit there and say, well, people regularly call me about this, this is what I think is the most important on the site, this is what really needs to happen there, here's some regulation that needs to be posted up on the homepage, all that kind of stuff. When we tend to build websites based off of that, we tend to build very non-good websites, because they tend to be focused more on the business needs versus necessarily the needs of the end user, where when we actually look at it from the other side and we're looking at some of these other areas, such as how people actually use the site today, what they really would want to use it for in the future, how do you structure information so that people can find things, and really how do you build the interface so that it's very easy for people to understand, you're going to have a lot closer chance to having some great user experience and actually being successful with your website. So the first thing we really talk about from that side is really, yes, you do need to have kind of that discovery process, that piece where you're actually getting some opinions and that kind of stuff. But the problem is that most organizations tend to stop there, where they ask opinions and they do that kind of stuff, and they don't really move along there. And so really what we have from that side is we kind of look at this in a three-pronged approach here, which is a really good process. The first looking at opinion, the second looking at structural, and then functional. And from opinion, there's a lot of things. This is really about interacting with people and learning about them. One of our favorite things, and I'm going to talk just a little bit more about it on a slide after this, is discovery workshops, but you also can do those single-person, in-person interviews. But another thing that we like to do a lot are personas, and kind of understanding patterns of people. From a structural standpoint, you have things like card sorting and tree testing and wireframing that we can do from that side. And from a functional side, we can talk about some of the audience targeting we can do and some of the usability testing we can do. But the key point of this slide, and really I'm going to go into detail on all these things, The key point of this is about this piece down here. One of the biggest things that we mess up with in a process is that we tend to actually go through and we do a lot around learning from people, building new structures, functionality and that, and then our stakeholders, we don't tend to educate on why this is better or inform them on how this is going to change in that. So a lot of times we wait until rollout or right before rollout, and we're going to discuss some of the things that we can do around that really to kind of help us alleviate some of the concerns and issues that we tend to run into from stakeholders. So Discovery Workshop is kind of one of those things that we've evolved over time. We used to be very much years ago doing the one-on-one interviews. Sometimes we'd sit down with the groups and that. One of the things that we really like about the Discovery Workshop is that actually the whole process is getting a group of people together and then actually having them interactively be involved. So what you can see up in front of you here is you can see kind of the different post-it boards that we have up here, and then you'll actually see some post-it notes on top of it. And then you can't really see them very well, but on those are stickers. And actually in this case it happened to be stars. You might be like, what the heck, you do this with stickers? I said, I've got to tell you that I've done this with both end users and business leaders, and each has been equally good from that side, that we get really positive feedback from this process. But basically one of the greatest things from this process is getting people to interact more on a group basis. And so it really is an alternative form of requirements gathering and focus groups. So one of the things we do is we bring them in, we ask them these questions you might see like here, like what do you currently like about the website? Maybe in its existing format. What do you dislike about it? What is important to you? So as a whatever, I want to be able to do this so that I get that in there. And what this really helps is you actually get people to write down on the post-it notes themselves and actually put their ideas down there. And you can see all we have the people add the ideas to the board from that side. And then what we have is we give everybody 5 stickers and we actually let them go. And if they agree with somebody else's idea, they actually put a sticker on it. And so one of the great things about this is one, it's kind of a community peer pressure of the process. And so a lot of times where we tend to do this is kind of off these theories of gamification. If you're not familiar with that, you can definitely do a search on gamification. This is talking about doing more interactive activities to get to better processes and that. But one of the things I really love about it is people get interactively involved. They really get to learn a lot from this process. But like I said, the stickers now, it's like, where do the stickers really fall in? Well, this is one of the things that I absolutely love about it, especially when you know for a fact in your room that you have 1 or 2 stakeholders that are big problem childs and always think their stuff needs to be the most important along that and there. What you can really do is all of a sudden they'll put up their idea, and their idea will be this needs to be on the home page. And then everybody's got these stickers and nobody agrees with that in there. And it's kind of this subtle peer pressure process, and what we found really effective is a number of times we've actually had that person that felt very passionate and stuff that has actually made a comment in the conversation saying, oh, I guess maybe this isn't as important as we thought it was going to be for our website and that. And so really the power of this doesn't come into people putting sticky notes in the stickers. What really does is the discussion afterwards, where you talk about the things that people have identified and agreed with as a consensus in the group are the most important things, and maybe kind of pushed off some of the things that were less important in there. So it's a really effective way of being able to kind of dig through and really find out not only what people think they want, but what they really want. So you get somebody to put on a post-it note what they think they want, but through the discussion you actually start to learn, and the stickers you start to learn that this, yes, this really is a high priority, or no, this isn't. So it's a really great process. Very simple format around it. You get usually want to have between 6 to 8 people to go through this process. Always, that really keeps it manageable, but you also don't want them to be related to the effort. So you're not going to obviously have people on your web team and the stakeholders that actually own the project. You're going to be doing this more with a larger group. You usually do about 5 to 10 minutes for each brainstorming session. It just kind of depends on your group and how easy or hard it is. We've seen them do it in about 2 minutes for each kind of question that we ask, and we've seen them take up to 15 to 20 minutes for that. And so afterwards we usually have a follow-up discussion. So the 5 to 10 minutes is not only putting your post-it notes up, but it's also adding your stickers and that kind of stuff. And then you have those discussions where basically you let the items that people added the most stickers to really lead your discussion to kind of down a path of what you actually think you should talk about. What you need for this post-it notes, some kind of flipboard, pens and pencils, and enthusiasm and patience. So it's not a very difficult thing in that. One thing I want to make sure is that you understand that discovery workshops are just a piece of the puzzle, and this is not your end-all, be-all where you should do this, because they will give you an understanding of people's wants and desires, but it's only a step in the right direction, because opinion doesn't always mean right. A lot of times we'll walk out and we'll actually sit down with the core team that we're working with as a client afterwards, and they'll sit there and say, well, that's actually not a big deal, or that's something there, or this person has this and that. So you've always got to take some of this, especially opinion-based information, with a grain of salt, that you're going to get in good information, but there's a reason that we do some of the other components of this process really to get at the desired result that we want to, and not just end it at opinion. So one of the next things you can do is you can do in-person interviews. A lot of times where we tend to focus is on, we don't like doing these in general, because again, you're kind of sitting one-on-one and you're just kind of listening to a person say, I want this, I want that, I want that, and you're not necessarily able to use the group-related situation to really help them understand where maybe their priority isn't as prior and or as important as you'd want. But on the other side, if you start doing that yourself, what a lot of times happens is that you start to get into a combative situation. So if you look at the third bullet point there, I really kind of say concentrate these on some of the politically challenged or people you need serious buy-in from. So one of the things I absolutely love in-person interviews for is not to learn anything from them, but really share with them the process. Help educate them. So you see, educate, educate, educate. So I like to do this. Like I recently was working with a college where I sat down with the chancellor and the college president, and one of the big things I did there is I sat there and I made sure that they understood some of the buy-in we needed from them, some of the parts of the process that may be roadblocks, and some of the things we're going to need, the support we're going to need from how it's going to work, and how the discovery process takes quite a bit of time and isn't something we can do in a week, and kind of all the things that kind of go along with that. And there. Some recommendations I give around that is, one, make sure that if you're going to do in-person interviews, to really ask open-ended questions. You know, again, you could kind of look at, what do you currently like about the site versus, do you like this about the site, or do you like that about the site? We don't like to try to lead people down these, and a lot of times when I see business analysts do this type of stuff, they're trying to lead you down a path so that they kind of get the information that they want back from this, and so you really want to do this. And the other thing is, especially if you're dealing with somebody kind of higher up the food chain, or somebody who may be a volatile personality, a lot of times up front I will ask for permission to ask for clarification in that. And so what does that mean? It means, so a lot of times somebody is going to share something and I might not understand that, or I might not agree with the supposition they're making. And so what I'll tend to do is I'll ask them, is it okay if I ask you for clarification and maybe have a discussion with you around some of your ideas to understand better your position, and maybe you can understand some of my thoughts. So I like to ask that up front, because a lot of times that will kind of at least slightly diffuse the person from thinking that I'm coming there to do combat with them, but instead asking their permission to say, is it okay if I disagree with you, or maybe ask you to clarify why you think that's really important compared to when I've heard it other places and it hasn't been, and that kind of stuff. So in-person interviews, from my standpoint, really have a lot of value from the standpoint of really getting that extra buy-in from challenging or important stakeholders, and kind of give them that, maybe a little bit more of that white glove feel, but at the same time you're kind of getting that real big opportunity to educate them on all the things that are going to be happening with the process. Now, you may still walk away from them not being overly happy about this stuff, and you know, from what it is, because they may still feel threatened, but you've started to lay the groundworks of your education so that you're starting to get used to them. Because one of the things from a communication standpoint is that communicating early and often can really help you effectively get through a lot of those anxieties with people that maybe up front they may not give you the best of all feel, and a lot of warm and fuzzies and that kind of stuff. over time what you're going to find is that where they're really coming from, and they're going to start to adjust to the new norm that is your new website. So kind of going from that, a lot of times from the discovery sections and kind of what we learn from there, we like to build personas. And so I kind of have mixed feelings about personas, because one of the things is that I think that personas are much larger than just focusing around a website from that side in there. But this is one of the things that I really like about personas, is I feel like it helps stakeholders know that you actually heard their needs and interests, that you actually understood, and that you're starting to kind of put together the different type of people that might visit their website, use their product, whatever it might be. And that. The other thing I like about it is it's a really great visual explanation point, and that kind of stuff. And so one of the things I really like about this is a lot of times, especially when we're working with government entities, there's a lot of concern around kind of hitting their different demographics that they feel like is important to know that they're hitting, from the different types of students at a college to the different types of people that apply for unemployment insurance at an unemployment agency, different type of people that interact with the Department of Commerce or whatever it might be in that. And so this is a really great way of being able to visually explain it and start to really understand the language and vocabulary issues you might have with the way you present information versus the way people understand information. The other thing that personas can really do is it can kind of help the process from being considered too IT-ish, because this is one of those kind of touchy-feely pieces that can really help kind of people feel like you're actually hearing their needs and that there's something more to this. But the one thing I'm going to be a little bit negative about personas, that I never really liked about personas, is I don't really believe that you can do a great persona around just a website, because personas in my mind should reach a much larger scale, and that you're looking at how you interact with people of different types. And that you could be an engineering firm where you have the type of engineer you'd work with, maybe the business stakeholder that you work with, and that kind of stuff. But it's not just about how you interact on the web, it's about how you interact through social channels, through your print, through sales, and everything like that. So a lot of times when we give clients personas, what we will encourage them to do is actually take our personas and go many steps further. So look at how you're going to interact with them on Facebook, or how you're going to interact with them via Twitter, how you're going to interact them through some of your marketing campaigns, that kind of stuff, and really kind of look at that from that side versus just taking it and putting it around the small box of a website. And so that's actually a very important point, because one of the things that I think a lot of times that we lose out in the web world is that we tend to think of websites as kind of their own little self-contained thing that have one meaning or purpose to people, versus really about how it actually goes through and interacts with your entire business process that you do in interacting with these people that visit your website. And so I think a lot of times organizations tend to limit themselves by looking at this very one or two dimensionally versus kind of looking at this whole depth, breadth, and width of what is actually happening to work with their end user. And that, so from personas can be very helpful for kind of helping you get some visual explanation of the product. But again, what I would encourage is that you take personas and you actually, whether you're an internal organization or whether you're a consultant working with a client, you really look at pushing those personas past just the web and looking at other ways that you engage with these people. So then we go kind of more to the structural side, where we start talking about information architecture in that side. And what is information architecture? So now we've kind of gotten the personality piece, the opinion piece, and now we're starting to look at the more structural side of this from there. Well, information is a structural integrity of meanings across context. What does that mean? Well, let me tell you. When you look at IA, you actually look at it broken down into 3 different areas, in that purpose, language, and people. And each of these actually have a very specific part of an information architecture. First, the first thing you have to acknowledge is that every single piece of information in your organization has a purpose. There's a reason that it exists. It may be not a good purpose, it may be a bad purpose, but it's a reason that it exists, from the marketing information you push out, to the employee guides you push out, to auditing, to financials, to everything. Every piece of information has a purpose inside your organization. And with that purpose, everything has kind of the cultural and political and everything that goes around that as to why that piece of information exists. The reason this is important is because we have to really understand why information is going to exist on the website, why it's important there, how it's going to do that, and all the things kind of in between there. But on top of purpose, we also have language, which is every organization has its own language. And this is actually very, very significant for a website, because depending on the type of audiences you're targeting, you may or may not need to really rethink how you use your own internal corporate language in that. If going back to kind of an engineering organization, if you were targeting a very specific type of engineering department or world or whatever it is like that, you may have some terminology that you use on a regular basis to be able to really tackle that. But overall, what you might find is that, especially if you're going out to Joe Blow general public and that kind of stuff, you may have to really take your vocabulary down. One of the biggest challenges we see in government space is that government is supposed to be, and I say supposed to be with air quotes, federally mandated to be, all government sites are supposed to be in the U.S. are supposed to be at an 8th grade reading level. And I would say maybe that covers about maybe 3 to 5% of all government websites in that, because they all like to use their terminology. One of the things we run into a lot in a lot of spaces is that people don't want to write simple content because they want you to know I'm smart. I want you to know I'm smart, so I want to write real sophisticated content, but the reality is that you have to be looking at this from the end user standpoint, which is kind of, well, are they super smart, or are they going to know those words and that kind of stuff? So the language becomes very important as to how we do that. And then we have this last group, which is people. And our world would obviously be a lot easier if we didn't have anybody visiting our websites, because then we wouldn't have to worry about it. But not only does every piece of content have a different purpose and a different language to it, but everybody needs that content for different reasons. They may have patterns that they follow, but overall that person is exploring that piece of content for their own thing, and they're going to look for it in their own way. They might find it through Google. They might do a lot of time exploring your site. They might have a competitor site and look for it the same on your site. There's a lot of things that people do around that. And so when we start talking about information architecture, we really have all these different pieces that kind of fit in here that make up how we look at IA and how we really understand that stuff. And that's really significant, because if you don't get this part right, you're probably not going to get much else right. And so you've got to understand the purpose of your content. You've got to understand the languages there that people are going to understand. You've got to understand the way people are going to look for your information in the first place and what they're looking for. And so this is really critical. So how do we figure some of this out? Well, first and foremost, we like to do card sorting. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Tree testing, another thing we can do it, and then some wireframing. So what is card sorting? Card sorting is basically, it's a technique that we've used for a really, really long time in the world of information architecture. And it really is about getting people to input how they see the structure of a site in that. And so card sorting itself is actually a very simple process. There's a lot of great online tools now you can use it. We use actually Optimal Sort, which we really like as an online tool provider. And basically what you have is, but if you're going to do this in kind of the offline world, is you have a bunch of 4x6 note cards, and on those cards you write different concepts from your website. It could be not necessarily saying like homepage, it'd be like content like our mission statement, or one of your specific products or something like that. And then you basically get it. I usually recommend that you don't really look at more than 80 to 100 of these at the max. And you sit them down in front of somebody and you say, okay, here's all this information that we see being on our website. Organize this as you would see it organized. So put them in the groups that you would group them. And then basically from that you have people actually group these things. So why do we do this? We do this because it can help us identify trends in the way information. Even though people may come from different walks of life and have different skill sets and that kind of stuff, one good thing is overall we tend to, in general, look for information the same. And so one of the things you have to think of when you're building a website is that you always have to build towards that lowest common denominator. Otherwise, if you are building a site that's for the smartest person that's ever going to visit your site that knows exactly your content, you're probably going to fail. What you have to do is you have to identify kind of that pattern of that person that isn't really sure what they're looking for, but needs to get something but might not be sure where they're going to go. So this can really help you identify trends as maybe how you're going to organize information. Because if somebody's not unsure, they might fail. But if somebody is sure and you provide them very simple options, they might not like the simple options, but they're going to tend to succeed more. Card sorts are really a great way to get your audiences and stakeholders, again, actively involved on that side. So what are the types of card sorting we can do? Well, the first one that I was describing where you have people group it, and then at the end of that process you actually have somebody put a, we usually use post-it notes or online you have it, but you basically give them the group the name. What would they call that group of cards in there? And so that can be very helpful from an open sorting. And so not only are you seeing how people group information, but you're seeing what they call those groups. And this can be very, very helpful from the standpoint of understanding how people, what people actually name your stuff. A great example is a lot of times, when we deal with colleges, we get a lot of colleges that want to call things financial aid and federally mandated and things like that. And what we find out is that a lot of college students, especially kids in high school looking to college, tend to call it money and that. And where that might not be the PC thing to call it from that side, overall there's a lot of benefit in kind of acknowledging the way people actually refer to your information. So if the key to a website is to get people to the right place, then wouldn't you want to use terminology that most people are going to get in that. And then closed sort is really our validation. So once we get done with the open sort, we kind of sit down, we go through, we look at maybe what we see these groupings to be and what we call these groupings. And then the closed sort is basically the exact same process, but now instead of having them name the groups, you actually have the group names up top, and then you have them organize the cards underneath those group names. So this is basically a verification step. Did we get it right the first time? Tree testing can also be a very effective thing. One of the things that I like about tree testing is, especially if you have a really complex IA, is to kind of test that IA before you go too much further in the process to really kind of understand. So tree testing is something that's kind of newer and isn't probably as widely adopted. But basically, kind of like you see here, now you kind of mix a little bit of asking usability questions or having people complete tasks, but instead of having a full website in front of them where they can click through, you're just having them click through a tree menu, basically, of like I'd go into the support center and then I'd go into updating business information and adding a business to Yelp. This is actually a tree test from Yelp in there. So you kind of have those type of things there. This I've kind of found tend to be very good with highly focused tasks. Otherwise, it's not real good to ask a real open-ended task, but actually see if somebody specifically can get there. One of the great things about tree testing is, especially if you have some volatility in your organization around your new information architecture, is it's a great way to kind of get people to see that your new IA actually is succeeding and what that means. But the piece that we never skip in a process is the wireframing step where you really do this. And this is really about two things. The one thing about that's really important from wireframing, where a lot of organizations really kind of mess up from a wireframing standpoint, is they tend to put a little bit too much design in here. And so what you have to realize that wireframe is really about page structure and language. So the language we're going to use and the page we are, which is why we would never bring color into a wireframe, because and more boxes and squares like you see on the screen there, is we're really trying to say, okay, does the location of this information make sense? Does the wording we're using to be able to get you there? And a lot of times once we're doing wireframes and we're interactively working with our client teams and that kind of stuff, then we're actually going to do a usability test after this where we're going to actually have people click through the wireframes to actually complete tasks. And the benefit is we're seeing, does just the placement and the language really help out versus bringing design, because design can actually make a big impact on the way people see things, so we want to really do it. I will tell you right now that this tends to be one of those really hard places to involve stakeholders. This is a really great activity, especially if you're going to do wireframe usability testing to do with external users, but it tends not to be as effective with internal users, and here's the reason why. It's because internal users tend to have this perception of not being able to see past what the design is going to be. Otherwise, they look at a wireframe, they think that's going to be their design, even if you put in an email or whatever like that. This is not our design. They tend to do it because most people cannot creatively think around that and just look at it for what it is in that. And so we actually tend to very much recommend that we don't use internal stakeholders, nor do we actually show a lot of internal stakeholders these processes. Have a question here from Jessica. Jessica is asking, what wireframing tool do you normally use or recommend? Jessica, we actually use a couple of tools. For our low fidelity ones, we use Balsamiq, which has become one of our favorite tools of choice. And then for our high fidelity, otherwise interactive wireframes, where a lot of times we're bringing both the desktop and the mobile view into play around there, we're actually usually using Axure in there, which was a very costly tool, but has now went to a monthly fee on top of that. The reason we kind of use Balsamiq first, one, it's probably the quickest to rapidly wireframe tool out there, but one of the things we like to do for our testing is move it into Axure, because then we can actually use the same interface and actually show how an interface would change from a desktop to a mobile version. But one caution is there's a pretty steep learning curve around Axure, in that there's also, and I can't think of the name of the tool, Infragistics has a tool as well, and there's a few other tools out there, but those have been the ones that we've tended to use as well. But great question from that side. And so again, wireframing is one of those really powerful pieces that really help us kind of get in the head of our users and really understand, do you understand the wording we're using and kind of the layout that we're using as well. And then kind of going from that, where we went from discovery, or I'm sorry, opinions to more of a structural type thing. Now we kind of look at this third piece, which is kind of more of a functional. And so you might remember earlier I kind of said that I'm not as fond of personas, because one of the things that I think of from personas that don't work real well with websites is you can tend to build a ton of personas, but they all basically have overall the same path that they're looking at going through. And that kind of stuff. And so one of the things we like to do is we like to do what's called an audience matrix. And this is basically, you think of taking personas and turning it into super audiences. Otherwise, you have different types of people with different types of needs, and what are those patterns that we actually want to match those to, versus sitting there and saying that we're trying to meet the specific type of person. We're trying to meet a more general class of people in that. And so what we'll tend to do is we'll map them to the actual personas themselves, and what personas actually fit in there. But you can see here, like for this college, navigating college life, looking for a career, just getting started in college, and that kind of stuff. It's kind of some super groups where you have more of these user patterns versus necessarily personas that go in there. And it's where you can find commonality groups there. And this is really good about track testing. So when you're actually doing your testing down the road, in that, are you meeting the needs of these audiences that you've defined and how they will actually interact with your site. Oops, I think I lost my, there we go. The last piece that we really look at from that side is really usability testing. And if you haven't done usability testing can be we do what's called heuristic usability testing. Otherwise, now you're actually getting to the point where you're actually having somebody sit down with either your website, if you're going to do something in like a pre-format or a post format, or with your wireframes or your designs or whatever it might be at that. But basically, here's where you're going to have it. Instead of actually getting people's opinions, now you're having people actually complete tasks. So you're saying, you know, go to the website and find our mission statement, or whatever like that. We tend to put them a little bit more into scenarios, such as, you know, you're a college student, you're looking to pay for college. Well, you want to find out what options you have out there to pay for college. Go find those. And so one of the great things about usability testing is this really helps us understand and get into people's minds about how they think and that kind of stuff. And so one of the things I really like about usability testing is this isn't us saying things. This is somebody else. And so you'll see my last bullet point down there. It talks about this being the greatest win with stakeholders. Matter of fact, if I could ever give you an encouragement, do a usability test on your current site, because a lot of times when you have people that don't think that your site's that bad, if you do and you think the site's bad, doing a usability test and actually having people miserably fail on camera can be such a big impact. And again, this is not you telling them, this is not a consultant telling them, this is Joe Blow off the street actually trying to complete something on their site and completely failing. And that is such a very powerful focus on that side. And so when we're doing usability testing, we're actually, you have somebody proctoring and you have, You can see there on the computer that you're videoing them. We use a software package called Murray. It's from TechSmith, the company that makes Snagit. Usually the most common thing, or Camtasia. But actually it records all the clicks in that and time to task and all this kind of stuff that we can kind of do along with it. But we found that to be a very, very effective tool for using it. They actually don't actively develop on it anymore, but it still works. Though there are some online products now out there that we could actually, that we've been starting to explore as well, possibly for some future things. But overall, you're having them go through, the proctor's having them run through a big group of questions or tasks to be able to be completed. Probably the most challenging part of this whole process is doing this and not wanting to input. Otherwise, letting the person go through it and succeed or fail on their own and not trying to prompt them and help them out and say, no, no, over here on the screen. Do this here and do this there and that. And so you really have to get a person who has that ability to kind of really manage their own expectations and not get too frustrated. So I really recommend that you have somebody, even if they're off the core team, that there's somebody that can be pretty objective in this manner. So when we're doing this, from a usability, we're really looking at 5 quality components. These break down into a lot of things. First, how easy is it for a user to task? You know, when we're looking at a public website, you know, one of our mantras is if you have to teach somebody how to use a website, you've already failed in that. And so it should be very easy. It should be very intuitive for them to do things. They shouldn't have to spend a lot of time learning. If you're doing this for an intranet or something that's more a business process, there might be more to that, and you may have some learning, but the question is how easy is it for them to be able to do it. Efficiency. Efficiency is not about clicks. It's not about how few clicks it is to get to a piece of information. Efficiency is about how easily I can go down a path to click a task. People are very, very willing to click multiple times as long as each time they feel like they're clicking in the right direction. Where people hate multiple clicks is when they feel like either one, I'm clicking and getting down to nothing, or number 2 is I click and I get wrong and then I have to back up and then I have to go back in and then I have to back up and I have to go back in. So efficiency is really about how fast can people get to the right piece of information in that, but it's not necessarily the fewest number of clicks, it's about the most efficient path that they're going through. Memorability is basically after I don't use the site for a while, do I actually remember where to go in the first place? And so this really kind of depends on how you're actually looking at it and what your site actually is. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll have something that maybe needs to go down the similar path, but we'll have one like is question number or a scenario number 1 we have them do, and then one is scenario number 15 we have them do after they've went through others for 30, 45 minutes, and then we'll actually have them do something to find something else down the same path, and we'll see from a reaction if the person actually was like, oh yeah, this is down this path down here, and that. Errors. Obviously, we never want to have errors in our system, but if somebody makes a mistake or if there's an error that comes up, are people really able to recover from those? But the last one can't be discounted, in that we actually have to have a good-looking design as well from that side. So all this kind of coming together really talks about the way that you're going to be able to get through this. From a stakeholder standpoint, what this really, really helps you from that side is you really get a good understanding and you get a lot more buy-in by not only pointing by, here our web team tried to build this website and this is what we came up with, or we talked to a few people and we built it off this. You're talking about a very methodical process that goes through a lot of steps and does a lot of different things. It really kind of helps people gather their buy-in throughout the entire process. And so the last thing I wanted to kind of share with you as I kind of wrap up here is some lessons learned and some of the suggestions that I can have with that. The first thing that we tend to really tend to fail out is that we tend to tell people what to do but never why they should do it. And so part of this really, again, where I kind of in that very early on slide talked about how we should educate people on a regular basis throughout this process, that's really what this is about. That is about helping them understand why this is going to be better, why you need to do it this way, why you need to write content via our content guidelines, why you need to only place images here, why you can't turn your text into green, why you need to do that, and really can help you get to that successful state around that, and people tell them why. As a matter of fact, when when we work with content management systems like Kentico, and we actually have people train up on them, one of the big parts of our training is also helping them understand why they should use the tool. And why they should do it the way the tool has it, and what are the benefits around that. And I find that to be very good, besides just saying here's what to do in that, because now you're actually helping educate people on why this is going to be helpful. And if people actually understand that, you're going to tend to get a lot less resistance from stakeholders when they understand that there's actually an end to this means, and what that really means to them, and how that's going to benefit them. Again, kind of finding the underlying resistance. I'll tell you a story from a number of years ago that has stuck with me for a long time. We had presented at a college I was working at, I guess maybe about 8 years ago. We presented to a large audience, kind of, here's the new architecture, here's what we did, here's some of the usability results we've had, and that kind of stuff. And really what we came out from there was a very good understanding, but then right afterwards I happened to be standing there, and I saw the person who was our key stakeholder just getting berated by an individual at this college, and this person was seriously upset. So I went and stepped in and kind of talked to him and had a conversation with him, and this person was really, really upset that their content was going to get rewritten, and they didn't like the new content guidelines and that. And so this person, I kind of talked through it, and we kind of understood it there. But what it ended up actually coming out is that this person had actually, the college had actually opened up a content writer's position, and this person actually applied for that writer's position and didn't get that writer's position. And so that's really why they were upset, is because they wanted to actually get that job, and so they felt like maybe if they screamed loud enough that this person wasn't going to write it as well as they would, maybe something would change. I don't know anyway. So the whole point is sometimes you have to understand the underlying resistance. We have actually been in situations where people feel like you're taking away their job, or you're making them obsolete in the process and that kind of stuff. So understand those underlying things that people feel threatened by, and that can really help you kind of get around those stakeholder things versus just trying to push through and trying to ignore them. And the last one that I'm leaving you with, and this is kind of something that we tend to learn all the time, is sometimes you have to win some, sometimes you learn some. And really what I mean by that is sometimes you end up that you can win a battle, and sometimes you just have to learn from a battle and move along in there. Just recently had a situation where actually we had a client that we're actually going to let part of their crew actually move away from us and do something completely outside of us, just because there is really no way that we can be successful with that group. And we realized that there's just no way we can be successful with that group, and we're going to just have them move outside the process. So sometimes you ideally always can win all scenarios, but overall, if you're not going to, the best thing is that you can actually learn something from those as well in that. So, well, I thank you all very much for joining me and listening to me talk about this. I realize, and hopefully, and I actually meant to say it, that this was not going to be just a Kentico conversation. This was actually something a little bit broader, but I will definitely open it up to questions for any additional questions people have over the next few minutes. Otherwise, everybody have a really great rest of the day.